I was going to do what was here in this book, daily psalms. But in opening this, I found a psalm that I wasn't familiar with.
No, that can't be.
Oh, hush. So I'm going to read the whole psalm.
Dementia.
Okay, listen carefully. I'm going to read the entire psalm.
Which number is it?
Which one is
I'm
it?
going to tell you later.
Oh.
Praise the Lord, all you nations. Extol him, all you peoples. For great is his steadfast love toward us, and the faithfulness of the Lord endures forever. Praise the Lord.
That's the one I read.
117, 2 verses.
Right, because Bernie was complaining about the length of the psalm and then previously, so I read that for Bernie, but he wasn't here.
Right, he's still not here. Oh well. But yeah, 2 whole verses. And apparently I wasn't paying attention the day you did that because I remember you doing that. Now that you say that. 2 whole verses.
Well, that's just about says it all.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So anyway, okay. If you remember last week, there was some discussion, and we looked up the verse in Maccabees about removing the sign of the circumcision for folks. So I went home and looked it up. And we had decided that it must have been metaphorical. It was literal. Yes. Now, first let's talk about why, and then I'll explain how. Yeah, because Susan's looking at me like, they're going,
You want me to erase the board so you can do some drawings?
There were pictures that I chose not to look at online, and one pen and ink drawing. But anyway, the reason for it is that at that time in Jewish history, in Judean history, the Greek culture had kind of, taken over. And the Greek practice of working out at the gym in the nude was the way they did things. And the Greeks worshipped, well, I won't say worshipped, but greatly admired the perfection of the human body. And their workouts were totally in the nude. It was considered very poor form, vulgar, you were just really low class if the tip of your penis shows without the, so the Jews who were circumcised were laughed at. You're just crass, you don't know how to behave. And so you got laughed at if you went because you'd been mutilated. The Greeks literally thought you'd been mutilated. And if you didn't go, they laughed at you because they knew why you didn't go. Not going was not good for your business because that was the equivalent of today's golf course. You go, you hang out at the gym, you network, you do business. And so they came up with, they could do it with surgically, but I think, I lost, and the Greeks came up with the term lipodermis was the condition of having a deficient foreskin, because even some little boys are born without enough. And so they came up with a way to fix it, and it was to put a weight on the end of what's left of the foreskin, because apparently circumcision doesn't remove the whole thing. And putting weights on it, because that'll
Stretch it.
It'll stretch it out.
Wow.
And because skin, you've seen pictures of African tribes where their earlobes come down to their shoulders because they've been stretched with
Because
weights.
they put those gauges in there.
Or old ladies whose earlobes are stretched out like.
Yeah.
From
Well, part of it is that, your ears grow your entire life. Your ears and your nose
They get
grow.
bigger as you
Yeah.
age sometimes.
Yeah, I know my dad's ears were just huge.
Oh, the better to hear you with, my dear.
Yes. But yeah, they'd stretch it out and then be able to literally remove the mark of the circumcision.
I wonder how painful that was.
And the definition of ball and chain.
Yeah.
So Nancy, does it look like the Sojourners class has reached a new depth? Oh, you're not
She's
there.
muted.
I have to say it's been an intriguing discussion so far today.
Yeah. We'll move on to
I wonder
tatas.
if that works.
Yeah.
Bodacious.
You know, you laugh when you say that, but when y'all were talking about stretching the skin, when you have a reconstruction, that's exactly what they do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And they put in something called expanders, and you go back periodically and they put more saline in it to stretch the skin.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so we're still doing it in different ways.
I always wondered who was checking to see if you were really Jewish.
Well, apparently it was real obvious when you were working out at the gym in the
I
nude.
guess that
Yeah,
Wow.
we've come full circle. Some of the pictures I see of athletes, especially women playing beach volleyball, they're pretty much naked too.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that's right.
But apparently this practice has gained, it has resurged. It's being practiced now. You know, boys are circumcised. You know, you get circumcised when you're an infant.
Oh, not
Yeah.
necessarily in the Jewish community.
Yeah,
but-
just in America.
Yeah, but
and,
there's now a lot of
There's
mixed
not,
opinion
they're not
about.
doing it, you're saying?
No, they are.
Oh.
They're
There's some folks that
Oh.
are seriously not wanting to do it at all, and then
Yeah.
some others that apparently.
yeah. And yes,
Well, the Jews have that breast ceremony. when
Right.
they're Little, I mean,
yeah, they're 8 days old.
my friend had one for all her boys.
Yeah.
So anyway, to
Yeah.
let you know that our discussion last week, it was literal, not figurative.
I'm thinking of an old ad, I think it was on Saturday Night Live, and it was a brick, they were doing a
Brick.
circumcision in the back of a car, and it was telling how smooth this car would drive. It was
Yeah.
A Lincoln or something, I forget.
Oh,
what
good
it
grief.
was.
Gee. Oops, I missed.
Sorry about that
Very-
pothole.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Well,
so
I'm glad I
somebody
came
just
to
came
some
on and then left. On Zoom, somebody just came on and then left. Sarah's iPhone?
Shouldn't have been. Did it say my iPhone?
Yeah, it said Sarah's iPhone.
It's not up there now.
No, that's what I said, it came and left.
It's scary with this. Okay.
God's trying to tell you something.
Yeah, okay. So that's the end of that. Okay.
What it's telling you is that Siri is always listening.
Yeah,
yeah.
it's true.
So is Alexa.
Oh, yeah.
Alexa's recording.
Yeah.
Yeah, I searched something, I wanted to know, we're off topic. Anyway, it just ended up dialing somebody that I know, it had nothing to do with what I was searching.
So I am only going to spend a couple of minutes on this book because Kathy pretty much covered this chapter. The chapter just does what you did in 5 minutes over and over and over
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which was to say that if you truly have faith, that faith will exhibit itself in works. Works by themselves are not enough to make you right with God. It's not enough for your salvation. But if you do, like my second husband said, I've been saved and they can't take it away from me. I don't need to go back to church. That's probably not what Paul had in mind. But I've heard several people say that. But if you truly have faith, that faith is going to show up in works of some sort. And they gave dozens of examples if you want to read about it until you throw up. You can do that. So what I got to thinking about was the history just prior to this period. And so, and it also kind of plays into what we were just talking about. So I went online and found, and I kind of jumped into the middle of the war with the Greeks and the Jews, the Jewish people. So I've kind of jumped into the middle of this.
And this is taking place when?
Is the temple still standing?
The temple is still standing because the temple doesn't get destroyed until 70 AD
By the Romans.
by the Romans. So this is Greek. This may be as much as 200 AD or BCE.
So is this the Maccabees?
Sieges.
Yeah, so I'm
We've
in
got
the
sieges up here.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is gonna probably be here with these sieges. So yes, this is the Maccabean period. And if you have a book, and this chapter actually talks about, I think it was this chapter, talks about, okay, that's the Herodians. Yeah, this chapter actually has a list of, in order, the Hasmonean or Maccabean leaders, starting with Mattathias at 167 BC, so a little after that siege, going up to 40, up to 37 BCE. So I'm not going to overwhelm you with dates. I actually wish this article had some dates. So we read the Maccabees, you know, for 1, 2, 3, 4. I think there are 4 Maccabees in the Apocrypha years and years ago. So some of this we've done. And it was in this war with Greece that the miracle of the lamp, which is the basis for Hanukkah or Chanukah, that's when it happened. It was in that war. So pop quiz. What am I talking about? What was the miracle?
The
Oh,
oil,
oil.
it was a small amount of oil, but that shouldn't have lasted that long, but it lasted for 7 days,
8.
8 days.
And that's why the menorah is eight candles. It's not 8 candles, but it's 8 plus 1 or something like that. And I think that's where it comes.
Right.
And this was in the middle of the war. It burned 8 days, but the war dragged out for another 5 to 7 years. They're not sure when, but it was with Greece. At the time of this miracle, Matta,
8 candles. 8 candles.
okay. Matta's, I can't pronounce it, not gonna butcher it. The father of the Hasmoneans and Jonathan, the oldest brother, were already dead. And then the year after the miracle, Judah, the third brother, was dead. They were killed in battle. And 3 years later, there was a major battle where the Greeks tried to conquer the land of Israel. And at that time, Eleazar, who was another one, he was killed when an elephant he attacked fell on top of him. Yeah,
There were elephants?
apparently. So.
Okay.
Yeah, learn all kinds of stuff here. So then, when the war was over, the only 2 surviving Maccabees were Jonathan and Simon. Jonathan was appointed the high priest, but did not assume the kingship. Now they've got 2 types of leaders. They've got a high priest, religious leader, and then a king who takes care of all the other stuff. So even though the Greeks were defeated militarily, they now try to undermine the Jewish government because they're still trying to get in. So they're, covert operations trying to turn Jew against Jew. So Jonathan, who is the high priest, is invited to a banquet by people he trusted. And there he was captured, turned over to the Greeks, and held for ransom, demanding the Jews to give up certain cities and allow the Greeks to enter Jerusalem to reestablish a foothold there. The Jews refused. Jonathan was publicly executed, and now Simon is the only one that's left. So he becomes the founder of what we know as the Hasmonean dynasty. So remember, there were a whole bunch of, it was like half dozen brothers, and one by one through this war, they all died. So Simon was a great and righteous person. He was loved by the people and the rabbis, and set for himself the task of rebuilding the Jewish state, reinvigorating the people, and throwing the Greeks and the Greek ideas out of the country. And he and the Sanhedrin, and part of my reason for going through this was to learn about the Sanhedrin and the Sadducees, they shared an identity of ideas and purpose. And Simon bowed to the wishes of the Sanhedrin and all ideas. Religion, he's the king. He lets them. So they got along real well. So he had been the king. His brother Jonathan was the high priest. Jonathan dies. Now Simon takes on both roles. Bad idea, because apparently they had a system of checks and balances, and that kind of destroys that. The leading rabbis told him, in a nice way, that a king of Israel had to come from the tribe of Judah. It says so in Genesis, the staff shall not depart from Judah. And besides that verse, it simply was not good for a system of checks and balances to have both positions held by one person. Nevertheless, there's nobody better. So they said, okay. And they actually had an emergency decree which allowed this for a temporary period. Temporary being loosely defined. So both the king and the court felt that this was such a circumstance. The threat of the Greeks was still very real. Still, it was held against him that he was both king and high priest. So he made other mistakes. I mean, he was human after all. Second mistake was to make an alliance with
The Greeks.
no,
Rome.
Rome.
Oh, because
This is-
the Greeks had invaded.
Right.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
This is where Rome
Alright, this
comes
is-
in, because the Jews invited the Romans in to help them get rid of the Greeks. And once they got rid of the Greeks, they couldn't figure out how to get rid of Rome, which came back to bite them in the. So, so at this point, Rome is still just this little bitty, young, small, upstart little nation.
Okay.
The third mistake, which is not his but his son, was to conquer and convert the Idumeans, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, a tribe in the south of the land of Israel. I'm not sure it's going to show up. Yeah, up there. I think it might.
Edomites?
Right.
Oh, okay.
So at this point, Judea is very strong militarily, and they expand their territories east, west, north, south, and
Oh, okay.
so they conquer and convert by force the Idumeans. Jewish law is very opposed to converting people by force. Those are not the type of converts Judaism is looking for. From those Idumeans will come Herod and a host of other problems. And the reason is the Jews don't see them as true converts because they were forced at the point of the spear. Like, yeah, I'll convert if it means keeping my life. So that was why they didn't like Herod. His grandfather was one of these Idumeans that was converted that way. So then Simon was assassinated by a son-in-law who was bribed by the Syrian Greek leaders. So his oldest son, John Hyrcanus, was a fierce warrior, immediately rushed to Jerusalem and installed himself in his father's place, both as the high priest and the king. Then he rallied the Sanhedrin and the people to his side, rescued his mother, who'd been held for ransom, and forced his murderous brother-in-law to flee. He would reign for a long time and die in his bed, which was a major accomplishment in those times. You know, nobody ordered him, tricked him into giving up his throne. But he left a mixed legacy. On the positive side, he helped strengthen the Torah education system, and he was personally scrupulous in his observance of Jewish law, and even improved the temple edifice at great expense. In addition, he threw out the Greeks, kept the Romans penned in around Caesarea. So, I mean, at that time, Rome was of such little power that they could just kind of put them in one town and say, okay, y'all stay there, we don't need you. He took over vast areas of what today is Jordan, repopulated the Golan with Jews, pushed the border of Israel all the way to the outskirts of Damascus. He took the seaport of Jaffa, and Jews became partners with the Phoenicians in shipping and trade. This is when Jews began to move to North Africa to establish trade routes. Jews also reached Italy and Rome. And see, this all happened between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. So I really wasn't, we had done this, but it didn't stick in my brain.
Right.
You know, I've got this very, it doesn't change picture of what Judah was like for its whole history. And that's not the case. I mean, at one point, they were big, powerful, pushy, warmongering, just like any other country. And during this time, a lot of the immigrants that had stayed, a lot of the people who'd been taken to Babylon and stayed, decided, hey, that looks like a place to be. Let's go back. So a lot of them came back at that point. So he brought the country prosperity and greatness.
Was this during the time that, so there was a point at which, I guess maybe when the Greeks were there, that they, didn't want certain Jewish customs to be observed,
Right,
and the temple kind of got desecrated,
right. Well, this is,
not kind of, it got desecrated.
well, it got desecrated more than once.
Okay.
Um,
So it wasn't destroyed, but
no, but they were sacrificing pigs
yeah,
in the temple at one point. So I'm thinking this is part of, but they've pushed the Greeks out at this
Right,
point.
right.
So,
so the Maccabees kind of went back in and
and clean things up.
cleaned things up.
Yes. Okay. Origin of the Sadducees. Harold keeps
Okay.
talking about Sadducees. This is their history. This is what really intrigued me.
Okay.
One of the great Torah leaders in the early days of the Second Temple was Antigonus of Soko. He said, "Do not be like servants who serve God on the condition of receiving reward. Rather be like servants who serve God without expecting reward." Okay, that sounds good, right? Do good, don't expect anything of it. Well, the Greeks took it because they had a similar idea, but their thing was it doesn't matter what you do because there's no afterlife. This is it. Do whatever you want. That's what the Greeks did with that thought. And so a lot of the people in Judah were going, okay, that sounds cool. I'll just do what I want because there's no afterlife. So that's where Harold keeps saying the Sadducees didn't believe in an afterlife.
Oh, the Sadducees adopted sort of.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Whereas more
But yeah, they were a minority.
the common
Okay, so let me just read
did
this
believe
section.
in afterlife, like things had developed and they did believe.
Right, most of them did. So I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs here so I don't mess this up. Antigonus had two followers named Zadok and Boethus, who interpreted his words as meaning that there was no reward or punishment, no world to come. If you do God's will, fine. If you do not, nothing bad will happen to you. God does not reward or punish you. That was also a basic idea of Hellenism. Events happen at random. There was no reward or punishment. What you did made no difference in the long run. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. What's the difference? Zadok and Boethus' interpretation aligned with the Hellenistic tendencies, not Judaism. The belief in the hereafter is central to Judaism, which posits a God who cares and who dispenses ultimate reward and punishment in a world to come. A person's soul does not just end bodily at death. Zadok and Boethus rejected those basic ideas. And so they were the beginning of their followers became known as the Sadducees. Right.
So what role did the Sadducees then play during Jesus' time? I mean,
Right.
so I recall it, so you're getting
Right.
there?
I'm getting there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right.
It's a wonder that it didn't just separate into another religion. If the
Yeah.
Jewish people, how come they were still accepted as,
I'll get to that. Money and power, in 2 words. Okay. So this is basically a political party. It was one thing to have those ideas, but another thing to initiate a whole movement based on those ideas and call it Judaism. So they're trying to usurp, the followers became known as the Sadducees. 3 planks of the party platform were: number 1, no life hereafter, no reward and punishment. Number 2, and this really gets at Judaism, there is no such thing as the oral tradition.
Huh?
Right. I mean, think about how everything been handed down orally because most people did away with that. And number 3, the priestly class is the ruling class. They said that the oral tradition was the invention of the rabbis and every generation had the right to reinterpret it. So it was a catch-22. If they could throw out what their predecessors held sacred, those coming after them could do the same thing. And it goes on to say the Christians have been doing this ever since.
What's the point of? I'm really confused. I mean, basically, what's the point of that religion? I mean, if you can do anything and there's no
Right.
afterlife, then there's no God.
Right. That's why the Sadducees.
So why do you need a priest? Or why do you need a rabbi?
And that's why the
It becomes
Sadducees.
political instead
Right,
of
it
religious.
becomes political,
History does repeat itself.
yes, and that's why the Sadducees don't exist anymore. They started a whole domino effect of human interpretation, which took the meaning of the text away from its divine origins. They had an agenda, undermining the authority of the oral Torah, undermined the authority of the Torah sages and the Sanhedrin, which fit in with the next plank, which was to control the government. So they said the government should not lie in the hands of the Sanhedrin because the Sanhedrin were the priests. No, the Sanhedrin were the sages. They wanted it to be the priestly class. So the Sadducees are taking over the priestly class. Basically, the Sanhedrin was democratic because the Torah is democratic. One does not require a degree to be a scholar. Respect for the Torah is not dependent on wealth or status. In fact, the Talmud says, be careful regarding the poor because from them the Torah will emerge. So the Sadducees preached the philosophy of the aristocracy. The upper classes were the only ones that knew enough to run the country. The masses did not know anything. You didn't have to ask them. And so they became the heirs of the Hellenists who preached the same. So you've got a few people with a lot of money, a lot of power taking over. And that's where the Sadducees came from. So they're espousing Hellenistic views when they say there is no afterlife. So now we're going to go back to John Hyrcanus, the most recent Maccabean. During his reign, the Sadducees began to become strong, and he helped strengthen them because he was arrogant and thought he was strong enough to keep them under check. The Sadducees worked on him for years. They told him the Torah sages were out to get him, that those sages thought he should not be king, that they would not let his son reign, and so forth. He listened because he thought it would not bother him, and in the meantime, he thought he could change the Sadducees' view to meet his. He was arrogant. I mean, he was a good ruler, he was a good Jew.
Believe good will prevail.
Yeah. The Talmud records the key incident that changed him. He threw a banquet where members of the Sanhedrin were in attendance. One of them, and it doesn't say why this happened, but one of the Sanhedrin accused him of being illegitimate. They said his mother was raped when she was held in captivity. And that was just, so he demanded an inquiry. The rabbis reviewed the details, cleared his mother, he was legitimate, but then that poisoned his attitude toward the Sanhedrin. You know, why would you say that based on nothing? What are you trying to do here? So he starts believing the lies of the Sadducees had fed him. And so this is the beginning of the conflict between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees represent, you know, tradition, the average person, so they've got most of the people, but the Sadducees have most of the money. And it's still true today, like you said, money talks. The Pharisees were the Torah sages, the traditional Jews. The Hebrew word means to separate because they separated themselves from the Hellenists and all outside influences. They attempted to remain in a pristine, unique state of Judaism. Later on, the Christian Gospels paint some very negative images of them, which becomes part of our culture, but they were the great leaders of Israel. In addition, Josephus even points out how the majority of the Jews sided with Pharisees, you know, at least 3/4 of them. However, the Sadducees were a very powerful minority. They were part of the wealthy aristocratic class and strategically placed in government. They dominated the temple, served at its priest, and so this is the type of thing that when Jesus comes into the picture, this is what he's trying to replace, which is why we're studying this book. The situation would lead to an all-out war between Jewish factions, a very uncivil civil war. It would be a political, religious struggle that would last 100 years and generate enough enmity to tear apart the Jewish state from the inside in ways outside enemies could not. Okay, any discussion at this point? Take a breather.
All right, so this is like during the 100s BC?
I'm
This Civil
thinking
War is going on?
so, like I said, they didn't give me enough dates. Usually an article like this, I'm drowning in dates. There are none. But yeah, that's what I'm thinking. It is that it's in this time, it's in this time frame, yes.
Right, because Rome invades in 63, so it sounds like the Civil War kind of, so they had been pretty strong because they were taking over extra
Yeah.
territory, and then that kind of fizzled out. And so for Rome to invade, I mean, they already had a,
Yeah, they've already got a foothold.
right,
Um,
so now they come in and invade in 63 BC. Okay.
So the Sadducees are, they're fans of the Hellenistic point of view. They were a potent, powerful force in Jewish society, but they were Greek, or at least like the Greek ideas. The rabbis did not take this lying down. They knew that if the Sadducees prevailed, there would be no Jewish people. There's always been somebody coming along trying to do this. Indeed, the Sadducees themselves will cease to exist after the Roman persecution. The only thing of theirs that has survived is that which was recorded by the Pharisees. It's like somebody came along and just wiped the Sadducees off the face of the earth. Theirs was not an ideology connected to anything eternal. It was a non-ideology couched in flowery words and pledging allegiance to some vague idea they called Judaism, which obviously wasn't. Now, John Hyrcanus came under the influence of the Sadducees in the latter part of his reign, and the government of Israel officially became a Sadducee government. He removed members of the Sanhedrin who were Pharisees and replaced them with the Sadducees. He also did away with many of the rabbinic ordinances and replaced them with the ways of the Sadducees, imposing with them a police force and an army. So he really gives them a lot of power. However, he was not the oldest son. Tradition must be followed, right? Oldest son was Judah Aristobulus, and he was nice and quiet, and he married Salome. Her brother was Rabbi Simon, and I'm skipping some of this part, who was not only a king, but according to ancient Jewish law, had the obligation to marry the widowed wife, remember that, of the leader of the Pharisees, and not about to let the people go under, Jewish people. So for the next 30 years, he will fight the battle for the preservation of the Jewish people at great personal risk. So Aristobulus succeeds to the throne, because he's the oldest, has his brother arrested and put in prison. He lasts one whole year before he gets sick and he dies. So in one day, the brother that's in jail comes out of jail, takes over the throne again, and even goes so far, because you're not supposed to make a big deal out of this. He gets a crown, gets a big tacky crown, and wears the crown all the time, saying, "Look at me, I'm the king." And he is now officially both king and high priest. Remember, this is not a good idea. Even though the Hasmoneans served as both, they were sensitive to the problems raised. Publicly, they went out of their way to call themselves kings. This guy didn't do that. He was showing off. Now, he is a great warrior. He is a cunning politician, which was good because the region was very volatile, even for the Middle East. So apparently the volatility of that area politically goes back over just thousands of years.
Thousands of years.
Yeah.
Right.
The first 15 years of his reign were years of endless war. He pushed back the Nabateans in the south. I have no idea who they are. conquered the entire Gaza Strip, which he populated with Jews. My, how history repeats itself.
Yeah.
In so many ways.
Yeah. He also conquered virtually every coastal city except Ashkelon, which remained in Greek hands. And north of that, until what today is Haifa, was likewise controlled by the Jewish state, except for the city of Caesarea, because that's where they put the Romans to keep the Romans happy. The Romans are still in Caesarea. It was a Roman legion. To the north, he conquered the Golan, established Jewish settlements there, which lasted continuously for almost 600 years. In the east, he conquered most of what is today Jordan. The Jewish control was on both sides of the Jordan River. He was also the first one to fortify the fortress of Masada. He lost a few wars along the way and came close to complete annihilation. However, he was wily, clever, and strong-minded. It took time, but he eventually carved out a small Jewish empire in the region. Yeah, I don't think of Jewish empire being two words in the same sentence.
Yeah, especially not during that.
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
Now, maybe I lost something here, but this is the same guy that is for the Sadducees.
No, this is his.
His brother came in, and his
Um,
brother
Reigned for a year.
for a year,
But the brother, this guy was the son of that guy.
the son of the brother.
No, the son of the one that did all that stuff. Then he dies,
Okay,
and that's when the two brothers come into play.
okay.
Um, Despite his military success, he's not popular because he's spilling lots of blood. Now the Spartans, remember the city of Sparta? They thought it was a great honor to die in battle. In fact, there was an old saying that Spartans would give their son a shield and say, come back with it or come back on it. It was an honor to lose your son in battle. The Jews didn't go along with this thought. So he's not real popular because lots of Jewish young men are dying in battle.
Okay.
And another reason is that he brought in a lot of non-Jewish mercenaries. And this was common back then. The abundance of these mercenary soldiers had a demoralizing effect because they brought their foreign gods in and their foreign beliefs. And then thirdly, the Idumeans, they come back again, who had been converted forcibly against the will of the rabbinic authorities, began to rise in the ranks and became the officer class in the Jewish army. So the Hasmonean army had a disproportionate amount of Idumeans in position of leadership. So, and it doesn't say why that happened, just that it did. Maybe that the Jews weren't interested in fighting this war. All of this brought about a great deal of negativism in Jewish society, especially in the Pharisees. And so he slowly but surely became an enemy of the Pharisees. So they didn't love him. Everybody wants to be loved, even a ruler. So the situation comes to a head. The worst example took place on Sukkot, which is one of the pilgrimage festivals when hundreds of thousands of Jews from all over the land flocked to Jerusalem, filled the temple courtyard. During the height of the most joyous part of the festival, Alexander Jannaeus, the guy we're talking about, as the high priest, performed a key part of the ceremony in an openly Sadducee way. It was intentionally provocative, and the audience was overwhelmingly made up of Pharisees. They responded by pelting him with fruit, and in his wrath, he ordered the non-Jewish mercenaries to slaughter at will, and they butchered 6,000 Jews in that day. And Josephus, who talked about it more than 100 years later, recounts how the troughs in the temple ran with blood. So, the king and his foreign mercenaries come into the temple and kill the Jewish people because they didn't like him. So now it's open civil war. He attempts to arrest the last of the Pharisee leaders. Most of them escaped. But those he caught, he executed by crucifixion. Guess where he got that idea?
Rome.
Rome. In one incident, he nailed 800 people to crucifixes in one day.
This was the Jewish king,
This is a Jewish king,
because the Romans did that during their,
right?
the war leading up to the destruction of the temple.
Right. In one incident,
Well, it was even more.
yeah,
They did.
he nailed 800 people to crucifixes along the road outside Jerusalem and killed their wives and children in front of them as they slowly died on the crucifix. And this
So
is,
things are a mess leading up to,
yeah,
Jesus.
so all of this is, happening shortly before Jesus' time.
wow.
Desperate, the Pharisees appealed to Demetrius, who was the leader of the Syrian Greeks, to help them. So they're going back to the Greeks and say, "Help! Come back! Come back! Kill this guy. We need to get rid of him." So the Greek defeated the Jewish army. However, his army had battalions of Jewish soldiers, and when they began to march toward Jerusalem, the Jewish soldiers deserted. They no longer wanted to fight their brethren. So Demetrius decides to withdraw. So the compromise. Alexander Jannaeus wakes up, figures out, he really has screwed up. He was still a descendant of the great Hasmonean family who had sacrificed so much for the Jewish people. He saw the debacle he had caused and called for troops.
That's actually, his name was Alexander. I mean, that's a Greek name.
Yeah, Alexander Jannaeus.
Okay.
So he calls for troops through the efforts of his wife. Remember, who's his dead brother's wife? She was real smart. Both sides came to the compromise. Alexander Jannaeus would run the government. The Pharisees would run the people. He would take care of secular matters, and they would take care of religious matters. The rabbi came out of hiding thanks to the urging of his sister, who was the queen. He took over the Sanhedrin and promptly kicked out all the Sadducees. He also cleaned them out of the priesthood. Most importantly, the educational system returned to the hands of the Pharisees. So, having the wise queen, she, she knew the right people. So they clean up, they get the Sadducees out of them. Though they would last for another 200 years, the Sadducees would never again reach the position of influence and power they enjoyed in the early years of Alexander Jannaeus. But they're still around when Jesus comes, they're just not as powerful.
Okay.
So Alexander dies in the year 76.
76.
So
BC.
it's before this,
Right
76
before Rome.
BC, so it's before Rome comes in.
Okay.
On his deathbed, he's quoted as saying, "Neither Pharisee nor Sadducee fear. Fear only the hypocrites, those who behave like Zimri and yet want to be rewarded like Pinchas." These were people who had an external piety but did not live up to the image they projected. He left 2 young children as heirs, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. The Pharisees pressed on the wife to take charge, which she did. Aristobulus was an aggressive warrior and believed in the Greek culture. Greek culture, they had trouble getting rid of the Greek culture. Apparently it was very attractive.
Well, it became the language even.
Right, yeah.
Mhm.
And
That's why the New Testament was written in
right,
Greek.
yeah, not Latin.
Well, Latin, yeah, right, but it wasn't written in Aramaic or.
No, that's true too.
It wasn't written in Aramaic, and Hebrew was pretty much only in the temple. So
Yeah.
it wasn't written in Aramaic or
Yeah.
Hebrew. It was written in Greek.
So Salome agrees to become the king because she's afraid that her kids are going to start going at it again. She appoints Hyrcanus the high priest and gave Aristobulus a few cities. However, Aristobulus fortifies the cities, trains a militia, waits for his mother to die, which she does a year later. Oh no, I'm sorry, she rules for 9 years. She was mourned by the whole populace because she had been genuinely pious, intelligent, and righteous. And here comes another civil war. End of today's lesson.
The takeaway for me is that human beings are not the most intelligent species.
Oh, I figured that out a long time ago.
Yeah.
I remember my dad used to say, if it weren't for people, this would be a great place to live.
Wow.
Yeah,
We
I had
study
no
on it.
clue that things were that turbulent.
right, that's why,
Yeah.
that's why I
And
decided
I
to
just
do
thought it was
this.
Yeah,
the,
I
the
know.
Greeks and Romans, I didn't realize there was all this turbulence among the Jews,
Yeah,
which is, I mean,
I just had this very homogenized,
right, right,
yeah, yeah, this was very eye-opening to me,
right.
and I thought I knew something, so.
You know, and I knew that in 70 AD, I'm sure we'll get into this later in the book.
Right,
that,
yeah.
You know, how bad that was, the temple was destroyed. I didn't realize how bad.
Yeah.
That was for Jerusalem and the Jews.
Yeah,
So there'd been,
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, and all this stuff is reason enough that this is very much of the
Right, yeah.
family histories and the stories when Jesus.
because, you know, the Idumeans, Herod's grandfather was one of these Idumeans who was forcibly converted.
Uh-huh.
And that's why the Jews hated him. It's like, you're not a real Jew.
Plus he was a real SOB. He
Well, that too.
was
But,
very
um,
violent.
But he didn't have anything going for him because he wasn't a real Jew.
Well, in that respect, but then, you know, just
Yeah, all the other bad stuff.
all the other bad stuff too.
Yeah,
So he didn't have the respect because he wasn't a real Jew. It's sort of like the Samaritans, I guess.
Yeah.
The Samaritans didn't have a lot of respect because they weren't considered to be real Jews.
yeah, because they intermarried with the conquering, invading.
Right. Right. Well, interesting. Well, thank you for that diversion.
Yeah. So, we start a new chapter next week.